Unbroken, healing through storytelling.
Hello and welcome to my podcast, Unbroken, Healing Through Storytelling. Today my guest is a little bit unusual compared to most of the episodes that I normally do. Somebody that I met over in the Instagram world who's also a podcaster, and he's a collector of stories rather than someone who is a thriver that I normally interview, but I thought we would go for it. So my guest today is Andrew Gold. Andrew is a multilingual TV presenter, podcaster and documentary maker with a keen interest in extreme beliefs and touching controversial ground. He's made and presented short documentaries on UFOs and the porn industry for HBO, and his hour-long BBC documentary exposing an abusive exorcist in the impoverished suburbs of Buenos Aires won festival awards and placed in the channel's Best of the Year list. He took English at Leeds Uni and later did NCTJ journalism qualification before starting his career at the much-maligned The Sun. He hated it and went back to work in France before stints in Colombia, Brazil, Argentina and Berlin, where he now lives with his Argentine partner of 6 years, Julieta. Hello and welcome to the show. Andrew, how nice to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Oh, you're very welcome. So I will start with my first question that I ask all of my guests. As the show is called Unbroken, what does the word unbroken mean to you?
I guess we're all in different ways on a spectrum unbroken. And I suppose, as you pointed out, my interest is more in collecting the stories of other people who have in some way been unbroken. And I'm fascinated by those stories. I'm fascinated by the people I've met over the years who have very, very different kinds of being unbroken. Healing. Well, as you say, healing through storytelling. I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. I wish I had a different slant on that, but it's exactly how I see it, and it's exactly what I suppose I try to do. Even the journalists ourselves, we are in many ways broken and become unbroken. Personally, I had my own sort of things going on when I was a teenager. I had a lot of really very strong obsessive compulsive disorder. Not the level, with like David Beckham, and he does lots of free kicks and stuff, and because he's obsessed with it, but it was something that really made my life quite difficult. And I'm sure there are various reasons that came about, both genetic and environmental, but it might have given me an appreciation of what it means to be unbroken and what it means to be broken, and part of why I embarked upon this career.
And do you still have any OCD tendencies now, or is that something that's kind of stopped?
Yeah, it's a really complicated one. So I had somebody who has very, very strong OCD on my podcast at one point, James McMahon, who's a NME music journalist. And he and a lot of people with very strong OCD can get very offended when other people say my OCD has helped me in some way, or I've got such bad OCD. And it's like David Beckham used to say, I'm not having a go at him, but it became very popular in, I think, the 90s or the 2000s. And when I had it, when I was suffering with it, it became very popular to say, God, I'm so OCD. Because of that, I changed the volume of the radio and stuff like that. I have to have it on an even number and stuff like that. I guess, like a lot of different sort of pathologies and disorders, the D part of OCD is very, very important, especially for people suffering with it, because the disorder means it's interfering with your ability to live a good life. And now I would not say I have OCD, and I've gotten to a point even where I can go to sleep with like the curtains slightly open, or not the door's not entirely shut, which 10 years ago would have been impossible. I was up and down, 5 a.m, 6 a.m, before school when I was 15 or 16, more than 10 years ago, I suppose, 16 years ago. Just, opening door handles. I used to go out into the freezing cold at 4 a.m, before school. It wasn't great preparation for school, and just check like the car door handles were locked or whatever. The car was locked. And I guess I was 17 because I had a car, and I remember I ripped off the door handle of my car. It just came off in my hand because for months and months I've been pulling it so hard because I didn't trust my own mind that it was actually shut, that it was closed. No matter how many, you'd pull it and you go away and you go, did I check it properly though? I'm not sure. So that was disorder. That was OCD. Now I would say I have OC. And the controversial thing is I personally believe that it's helped me in many ways, and I've managed to sort of, filter it and funnel it to a way that it actually helps me to obsess, for example, about positive things, about my work. I will not stop working and I love it, and I won't, if there's anything I've got to do, I have to do it because it's a compulsion. And people with OCD take issue with that because it's like I'm sort of exoticizing an illness. So I just wanted to be very clear that this is very distinct for different people.
I guess it's about a balance, really, isn't it? If it overtakes and it exhausts you and it interrupts life, then it's damaging, really, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what it is, exactly.
And I'm wondering, because I know you share the same birthday as my middle daughter, whether there's something about people born on March the 21st, because she will eat her food in order. She only likes even numbers. There's kind of a bit of something going on there with these March babies. Anyway, so where did this fascination from collecting these stories? And, you do speak about important issues, but you do like the controversial stories as well.
Oh yeah. It's actually a big mix for me. When I look for a story, and it was always the way with the documentaries. Now it's more the podcast episodes. There are two things that I generally look for. One is that it has that quirk or the controversial aspect, as you say. So I'll talk to a psychopath because I'm just fascinated. I want to get into the mind of what a psychopath is, and sometimes really controversial people and really people on the edge, so to speak. But that's never
good name for a podcast show, by the way.
Exactly. You know what? I managed to find a title for a podcast that was so sort of vague and all-encompassing that anything can fit. I mean, so I even had we've talked about Daniel Finkelstein on the podcast, and he had just written a book called Everything in Moderation, which is the polar opposite in meaning to On the Edge. And still it was like, I'm having him on to talk about the opposite of what the title is. So, you can have that's what we do as podcasters. We're just interesting people.
Yeah.
So
great.
But for a documentary subject, it's got to be that quirk, that edginess, that's, and also some profundity, some depth, a difficult life story, something that they've learned from, something we can learn from them, some darkness perhaps. And it's the mixture of the two. So I'm not really interested in one of those two things on their own.
It's a little bit kind of Louis Theroux-like, really, isn't it? I'm sure you've been compared to that before. Or are you a fan of Louis Theroux's work as well?
Yeah, that guy. I love Louis, and I grew up loving Louis. And what's interesting is he really moved away from, if you look at the two things I mentioned, sort of the quirk or controversial aspect mixed with the depth, he moved away from the quirky stuff as he got older, which might be a natural progression. It might be that you're more entertained and excited by the quirky stuff when you're in your 20s and 30s. And maybe he didn't want to be sort of hunting for ghosts or aliens and the porn industry in his 40s and 50s. So I understand that. And I feel like there's a little bit of a gap now. Interestingly, his podcast, now he didn't go for the old Theroux stuff that we all loved at all. He hasn't gone for that. He's rather gone for famous celebrities and people he knows and stuff like that, which is obviously a guaranteed hit at the box office. But I was surprised he went for that. And I was relieved as well, because I thought if he did that, he would just corner the market on that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm happy he didn't. But he taught me a lot. I don't know him, but watching him taught me a lot about how to be a presenter. Just little subtle movements he does, the way he tries to get information out of somebody. If somebody, let's say a neo-Nazi who doesn't want to reveal information to him, when they're saying no, and I've seen Louis go and then just walk off, and they're sort of left sort of behind him going, where's he going? And it's a psychological thing, I think, where they then try to catch up with Louis, and they go, well I'll tell you, I will tell you one thing, and Louis going looking totally disinterested. And I guess that taught me a little bit about psychology. The more you want to know, the less people want to tell you, right? It's
kind of talking to their ego, really, isn't it? They can't resist it. They have to, hang on, I want to tell you this.
That's what Louis does, isn't it?
Yeah. So why did you decide to start a podcast? Because you are a journalist and you may have made amazing documentaries.
No, thank you. Yeah, it was just a case of it's so hard to make the documentary. So even this Exorcist film we made, that was sort of my big hitter, so to speak. And that took years. I made it just with a friend of mine called David Hayes, who's a fantastic cameraman and director. And it was years, and it was, we had to learn to edit and all of these things. And then we managed to get a production company to help us towards the end. They were brilliant, Villager Films. And it took years to sell and for the BBC to watch it and all of these things. And then it got to lockdown, and it was like, okay, what was already impossible became even more impossible. You can't even go and film it, let alone sell it somewhere. And I'd always thought, okay, I should start a podcast because I had all of these people I wanted to talk to. As I say, that psychopath person, or the coffin confessor, who's somebody who gets paid $10,000.
I read about that one. We're going to talk about that one.
He's great. He gets paid to go and reveal secrets of people's funerals. Amazing guy who had been through, he's unbroken himself, and through storytelling, of course, as well. And we can go into that later, of course. So all of these people, and it was like, well, I've got nowhere. What do I do with these people now? I'm desperate to talk to them. So I became one, like both of us, of the million people making a podcast, hoping that it would make some sort of indent in the podcast industry.
And you have. It's been really successful, hasn't it? You were picked up by Apple in the new and noteworthy section, and you have many, many thousands of downloads for every episode.
Yeah, it's gone better than I ever, it's part that the OCD or just the OC stuff, Orange County it sounds like, but just that obsession. And I personally, I always set goals that are achievable and don't think beyond that. So for me, it was just a case of, I want to get to 3,000 downloads across the podcast, like for a month, within a year, because I think 50% of podcasts don't even get 50 listens in a month or something.
So I'm doing okay compared to you. I've got more than 50 listens.
Yeah, no, exactly. You definitely are. You're doing very, and it's got up to something like 20,000 a week now. I'm getting, it's just come from nowhere. It seems to.
It's amazing. And when I look at the statistics, you can go and look at your stats, and I love to look at the worldwide. I think, who is listening in Uzbekistan and Japan and Greece and all these, 70 odd countries, wherever it's listened to? That I find amazing, how it just travels in the ether and they get to know about it.
They don't seem real, do they, the listeners? I mean, they're listening now, aren't they? And it's. I guess you're probably the same as me. I imagine you like when people get in touch to say, I love the podcast, because otherwise it does feel like you're shouting into the wind, and then you get these statistics saying tens of thousands of whatever, enough to fill a football stadium, and it doesn't feel like you've just spoken to a football stadium,
Yeah, no, it just makes it all so worthwhile. And it's so moving when you hear actually the impact just listening to an episode can have on someone. It makes it. I've been loving my podcast journey. It's brilliant. But yeah, when I get messages or reviews, it really makes a difference, doesn't it?
It's very nice. It's a nice feeling.
So we mentioned briefly your documentary for BBC Three, The Exorcist. That is quite a tough watch in some ways, really, isn't it? Because it's very disturbing what this Padre does with mainly young women. I didn't notice him ever working on any men.
The Padre, which is, for those who don't know, that's Spanish for the father. He was a priest.
How did you find out about this anyway? Let's start at the beginning of it.
Well, I was living in Buenos Aires. I'd been there for 6 years. I lived there for 6 years. I had been there for maybe 1 year at the time, and was just trying to get involved with the culture, learn the language, because I already spoke Spanish from living in Colombia, but it's a very different Spanish. It's about as different as it's almost a different language. It's very Italian and everything in Argentina. Lots of sh sounds, for those who know chicken in Spanish, pollo. In Argentina, it's pollo. So it's really strange.
Very different.
Yeah.
We get into the Spanish lesson as well.
Yes, and we will continue. Hola, and no. So, learning language was great, by the way, and that was something I never thought I would ever be able to do, because I was rubbish at it at school. And that just gives you, it opens up the world to you in a way that I never thought my brain could do. And it's just been the most amazing thing. I've loved that. I love that more than anything I've ever done. Is just learning.
And you speak
languages.
about 5 languages, don't you?
Yes, yeah, although I've lost my Portuguese, and I include English, which is cheating, but my French, Spanish and German are pretty fluent. And that's not because I'm good at languages. People are always saying like, "Oh, you're good at languages," and I simply am not at all. It's just that I expose myself to those languages, living in those countries for long enough. And babies can learn languages. Obviously, our brains become less elastic as we get older.
We're not a sponge like.
Yeah, but we can do it if you're there long enough. And part of it was an obsession of learning the language, was just flicking through the local TV channels. And they've got these TV channels in Argentina, a little bit like we might imagine of the States, that we don't have so many of in the UK, which is like pastors and priests and things who are, talking about spells and magic and things like that.
Because religion plays a big part over there in the culture, really, doesn't it? Yeah.
That's right. It's very, very Catholic, although this particular priest is apparently Lutheran, although I don't believe he actually belongs to any denomination. I did a bit of research and it was very shady as to whether he was just like a lone ranger or not. But yeah, it's very Catholic, and where he was operating was in the impoverished suburbs of Buenos Aires. So there's very little in the way of education, in the way of mental health. There's no talking the way we might talk about, okay, if you're a child in the UK nowadays and something's going wrong and you don't feel good, talk to somebody. Over there, it was basically, and this isn't true of the whole of Argentina, of course, this is just certain parts, there are pockets, but over there, if you've got something which we would imagine would be schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, bulimia, anorexia, all these kinds of things, over there, they might think it's a demon of some sort. So I saw him on TV a few times. I didn't know much about him, but he was very, very vain, and he did a lot, his masses. I know that he held mass and he played the music from the film The Exorcist. So instantly I was like, okay, something's a bit off with this guy and I want to find out more.
So you had your doubts when you started, because watching the documentary, you changed your mind very much for very anti him towards the end. But at the beginning, you're not quite sure, because you helped as well in some of the exorcisms. You were ringing the bells. And yeah, so what was that like, taking part in it?
It was horrific. It was really horrible. And again, I guess for those who do know who Louis Theroux is, who are listening, which is probably a fair percentage of the audience, for those who don't, he's a presenter of documentaries, and he often used to take part in the things that he was doing. So if he was doing something about UFOs, he would go on the hunt for them. If he was doing a thing about strippers or something, he would strip and on camera, and it's quite funny and quirky and silly, but then there's maybe some depth a bit later on, or something you learn later on. So we thought, okay, we're going to go in with that angle. It was me and my friend David, and we thought, okay, I'm going to take part in the exorcism. Now, personally, and everybody, I have no judgment at all about what everybody has different beliefs and stuff, but personally, I don't believe in anything, supernatural like that. Whereas David was a little bit more open than I was, and that's fine as well. But even so, we thought this is going to be a bit of fun. And when you watch like exorcisms and stuff on YouTube, if you see what like Vice have done and the kinds of like mini documentaries, it does come across as quite funny. And people could laugh at that because you don't get to know the person being exorcised generally in those documentaries. You just see these people, you don't speak their language, and they're sort of othered. They become something else. That's my experience anyway. If I was flicking through and I saw, oh God, who's getting an exorcism? That's ridiculous. In this case, I spoke their language and I was able to speak to the people getting exorcised. And it was very frustrating for me coming from a place where, as I said before, we would imagine they talk a lot about intrusive thoughts. They talk about urges. They talk about, shaking and all these kinds of things, which I'm not a doctor, of course, but, I relate to it myself, having had OCD.
Yeah, to me, they look like they all had mental health issues, really. And the majority of them were young teenagers, young women in their 20s, early teens, really, weren't they? There were all, a lot of females, eating disorders.
Yes.
And I'm a psychotherapist as well. So generally, there's something behind why someone has an eating disorder. That's just one of the side effects, I guess, of a trauma. I wouldn't have said it was a demon in them.
Exactly. But it's very frustrating when you're there because, like, for someone like us, because everything that they, all those symptoms we talked about are also how their traditions tell them that an exorcism might be involved, you know?
Yeah, it's how they're conditioned, isn't it?
Yeah. So that was very frustrating. And I actually knew these women, and you're right, they were almost all women. And, you know, we were there for about a month with this guy, and that's what it was. But so I'm tempted to say he mostly goes for women, but I can't say that for certainty, you know, with any certainty, because we weren't there long enough, but that's what it seemed like. So you're there, and you've got, for example, Candela was one of the main the protagonists, basically, of our story. And she did have bulimia and anorexia. She was cutting her wrists. And this is it. Behind camera, you become very close with these people and their family. All off camera, but it's, you know, months in the end with the filming and editing and everything and getting together. And it's a 17-year-old girl who has nowhere to go, nothing that she can do. And I say to her, like, do any of your friends have any of these things, like eating disorders and that kind of thing? And she's like, no, because nobody talks about it. I'm sure many of her friends do have those issues.
Yeah.
They
and self-harming by the sound of it if she's cutting her arms.
Oh, yeah. And so, yeah, she's, you know, you have all these conversations, you meet the family, you do all these things, and then suddenly you're standing there dangling stupid bells, which is what I was doing for this exorcism. We didn't actually do it for Candela. We did that for another woman called Natalia, who I didn't know as well. But I'm over her head dangling bells, and she is screaming and screaming and screaming. And the documentary, of course, it's cut down to 2 or 3 minutes each exorcism. We only do 2 exorcisms in that documentary. In real life, you're talking an hour and a half, and there's a woman in the most vulnerable position you can ever be in, screaming and screaming. I likened it a little bit to a pregnancy in my mind. It was like, I shouldn't be here. This is such an intimate moment. And it was even to the point that, like, the father was made to wait outside the room, and he came in and was very shocked afterwards. And it felt like an old-fashioned pregnancy in that sense. And very quickly, in my first exorcism, I realized I shouldn't be taking part in this. This is a very dangerous, very serious and traumatic thing that is happening. I'm not going to take part in it. I'm not going to do a sideways smile to the camera. This is quite serious. So I was shocked and scared the first time, and after that, didn't take part anymore.
You were shocked and scared at what they were going through, or what the whole ceremony was, or just all of it?
Well, I don't believe, again, anything paranormal. So there was no thought in my mind of, like, oh no, what if, you know, the devil turns up, or anything like that. It was 100%. I guess it's something that very few people ever experience outside of maybe the mental health profession, which is to see someone in a state like that, especially someone you've gotten to know, but even someone you've just met, seeing them that vulnerable on the floor in front of you and screaming and screaming. And look, okay, even if I don't believe in the paranormal, some of the things they did and said were quite scary. They took on these sort of deep voices, demonic voices, saying, she's mine, and that kind of thing. And yeah, that is scary, but it's scary because you're watching someone go through something quite extraordinary and feeling like it's not good, and feeling like I'm in some way responsible. I felt like, oh, you know, can it stop now?
Yeah, I think it would take place whether you were there or not, really, wouldn't it? I don't think you were responsible.
Well, you know, you're sitting there and you're not doing anything. I'm not saying I blame myself. I'm just saying it was a slight feeling I had of, like, I'm not intervening. That's it.
And it was interesting because they all seemed to respond in the same way, weren't they? All shaking, all screaming for hours, and then there seemed to be this relief. But I guess if you were screaming for hours, you would be relieved once it was all over.
Exactly.
And they seemed to get to a place of peace, but then it did suggest that actually a few months later, the symptoms were back, because you're not getting to the root cause, really, are you?
Exactly.
So it's kind of taken advantage of very vulnerable people, is really what came across, wasn't it?
This was it. And it was, you know, he's obviously practiced in this, he's trained in this, and it's been years and years. I have to be slightly careful what I say, but not really, because he doesn't speak English. But when we put
it's fine.
Well, when we put the film out, we had to send him, because the BBC are very careful. So we had to send him a list of accusations that we were making to give him the right of reply, which was a strange thing to do to this exorcist, like man of the cloth guy in the middle of nowhere in Argentina. And so it was like 14 allegations or something that, you know, we intimate that you were living and having some sort of relationship with this particular woman, that you were doing this to other women, you were taking women out of psychiatric wards who were suffering with schizophrenia and things like that, telling them they had a demon, all these things. He just replied like capital letters, like, I do not give permission for this film, and that was it, basically. So he had his chance to reply. It's just so I don't have to be careful what I say, really. I mean, you never know with these people what they really believe, and it's whether they're a fraud and they know they're a fraud, or whether they really believe in their powers. And I suspect it's somewhere between the two, some sort of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, no, because he looked like he believed he was God. You know, he had that kind of God thing going on about him, that he was it. And then I was just like you, then wondering, but does he know he's really faking it and he's really ripping them all off? So it was very intriguing. I will put the link in the show notes afterwards, and people should just go and watch it. Oh, there's so many stories that you have. Do you have a favorite podcast episode? I know that's very hard to pick one, or is there one that jumps out at you? Or
yeah I used to say the psychopath woman. There's a female psychopath, M.E. Thomas. She wrote Confessions of a Sociopath, and we talk about the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath, and I think everybody seems to say different things about that. Some people say they're synonymous. John Ronson seemed to find that they're synonymous. She was saying there's a difference between, you know, you're born a psychopath, whereas a sociopath you develop as one in the first 2 or 3 years of your life if you are treated badly and you don't develop empathy. So it seemed to be different. And I loved that because I had a bit of a rapport with her. I also sometimes get frustrated by, like, we do live in a world of sort of social media and stuff where we're all trying to out empathy the other. We're all trying to show that's the currency of the day. Whereas like in the 90s, it might have been like how cool you were, how many people you had slept with or whatever, because that was cool back then in the 80s and 90s. Today, it's how much empathy you have and what a good person you are. And there's nothing wrong with, you know, that's a good thing to aspire to for all of us, right? But what a relief it was to sit down and talk to somebody who says from the beginning, I have no empathy. And I was testing her and I was saying, but what if somebody came in and strangled me now in front of you? And she was like, Andrew, you don't understand. I wouldn't care. No. I'm like, what?
She had great insight then into her tendencies.
Yeah.
And was she even empathetic with her own tendencies? I mean, did she use them, or how did she live her life?
The interesting thing was that she's a Mormon, and she's still a Mormon today. And she said that she doesn't know if she believes this or that, but she likes to use the guidelines to live by because she doesn't have her own moral compass. Okay. And she has a vague feeling of wanting to sort of not so much do right, but to just live life and to not go around murdering people. And
I'm going to have to listen into this one.
She was great. And I mean, obviously movies and stuff, you see a psychopath and they go around murdering people, and she's never murdered anyone. But in her book, the way she describes it is like the very beginning, you get this passage where she goes into her garden, she's got a swimming pool, and there's like an opossum, a baby opossum that's trying to like swim out of the pool. And she just looks at it for a while, and then she gets her net and then just slowly pushes it down under the water. And it escapes a few times. And then she just goes, ugh, and just leaves. So she didn't have to kill it. She didn't feel, I must kill. But she didn't really care, and it would maybe be easier for her if it was dead. Anyway, she came back hours later, and it was dead in her pool, and then she flushed it out and whatever. So it's like a real apathy. And I was just fascinated.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a little bit of a push and pull inside her, because she does follow a religion, and it's almost like she is looking for some guidelines or some boundaries despite what she knows is going on with it. That's just a therapist in me, sorry. I can't help it.
No, it's fascinating.
It is. And what do you think people would say when you give people like the paedophile airtime? Do you think that is something that you should do? Because I haven't watched it, but I know you went and you met someone in Germany, so I hear you speaking German. I'm assuming it's in Germany. And you speak to him about being a paedophile. Do you think that's right to give him airtime?
Yeah, it's a complicated one, and I think you touched on a really interesting subject. So, because podcasts are very different to documentaries. So in my show reel, you might have seen I was talking to one paedophile, and you can see the back of his head. Whereas the podcast episode, it was episode 6 of my podcast, he wouldn't show, he was audio only, and we changed his voice slightly. I made it like half a baritone lower. But it's a really interesting point about podcasts compared to documentaries. For example, The Exorcist, I wouldn't have had him as a guest on my podcast because I don't want to platform his views. When you have a podcast, it feels like you're having someone on to sort of, it would be awkward to call someone up you disagree with and say, hey, do you want to come on my podcast? And then go, you are terrible. And then how do you say goodbye? How do you email them afterwards to say, hey, please?
How can people not get in touch with you?
Exactly. Yeah. Don't get in touch with you horrible person. So I wouldn't want to have somebody who had horrible thoughts or did horrible, actually scrap that. It's not horrible thoughts. And that's the point about the paedophile. It was somebody who's done horrible things and stands by them. I wouldn't want to have on. So I was researching paedophilia because I'd done exorcism, I'd done abortion, I'd done UFOs, all these different things. I moved to Berlin, and in Berlin, by coincidence, I started looking what's interesting about Berlin. Berlin has the world's only therapy clinic for paedophiles that doesn't ever report them to authorities, no matter what they've done or said. And the point of that is that it gets them to come in. They have total anonymity no matter what. And the bad side of that is you're releasing them back onto the streets where they could harm more children. So it's very controversial. But I started investigating that and looking at it for a book I'm writing. I'm writing a book about secrets at the moment and the nature of keeping a secret life. And it was really interesting being in Berlin. There's the paedophile thing. What's it like? And I met a 25-year-old woman who's one of the most interesting ones, who is a paedophile. And she's marrying a 27-year-old guy who is also one. But neither of them have ever offended. They just have the urges, and they're getting married together, and they're going to support one another. Now, the guy I had on the podcast was a guy called Silas. That's how he goes. I don't know any of their real names, but it came from years of research to find these people. And I don't have any interest in talking to offenders. It's just, I don't want to platform them. I don't want to do anything like that. Silas is 18. He is the head boy at his school. And unlike a lot of the paedophiles who are very sort of world weary and tired and depressed because you can't have a life. Again, I'm talking about non-offenders, of course, but they hate themselves and they can't have a life, and nobody feels any sympathy for them. And I'm not suggesting you should or shouldn't. I'm very objective and I'm outside of that. But Silas is a head boy, and I thought he would give us a fascinating insight because he's very positive and optimistic. He believes 100% in his ability. I suppose we don't want to trust them, and I wouldn't let him babysit my children. But he says, I would never, ever do that. That's the worst thing you can do. And one of the worst things I've learned, one of the risk factors for paedophiles, the ones who might one day attack or whatever, is when they aren't aware of how bad it is for the child, and when they're able to use cognitive dissonance and cognitive bias.
I guess the very fact they've gone to this centre, they are aware they have an issue and they want to do something about the predicament they find themselves in. Yeah. Exactly. God, how do you remain non-judgmental when you speak to people like that? Coming from someone, as you know, I'm a rape survivor. It would be tricky, I think, for me.
But you're a rape survivor who forgives in your mind anyway your attackers.
Yeah, I did, yeah. But it still would be hard for me to sit down and have a conversation with someone that was a rapist.
Yeah. And as it would for me. I mean, I don't know what he's done, but I don't know what anyone I've spoken to has done. And what he's told me is that he's never done that, and he never would. So that's the key difference. And I think a problem we have, I guess, and again, I'm not overly interested in the whole subject. I'm very wary of becoming like the guy who's looking into that, it's just a thing I've been doing the last sort of 6 months or so. I've looked at that among other stories. But in Germany, they have sort of different words. And I made a big mistake with the community. So again, I got into this non-offending paedophile community in Germany. And I was on their forum. I introduced myself. I was always very honest with them. I said, I'm a journalist. If you don't, anything you say to me, I might use in a book or whatever, unless you tell me not to. I promise I won't. Definitely, nothing that will identify, whatever. And it took years to earn their trust because they don't like journalists. And after like a couple of years, there was this moment about 6 months ago, I think, when Madeleine McCann, her assailant, her attacker, was apparently identified, who was supposed to be this German guy who's in prison for other offences. And now this guy has, I think, raped and murdered a lot of adult women as well as children. Horrible, horrible person. Anyway, I went on the Community and I thought maybe I can get the big scoop here, and sell it to the newspapers in the UK, or I don't know what. So I said, hey, does anyone here know about this Madeleine McCann attacker, this guy, this paedophile? Because it would be interesting to hear any thoughts or whatever. And they went berserk at me. They were livid. And my first thought is, because I saw like 100 replies that were angry, my first thought was they were upset that I suggested they might know somebody who's attacked someone, because they would never attack someone. That's their whole, their whole point of their forum is that they don't do that. It wasn't that. It was that I'd used the word paedophile to describe this guy. And they said that is not what a paedophile is. He is a pedocriminal. Okay. A paedophile is somebody with, in their minds, with the attraction, who would never ever do that. And the whole point of the file thing is, that means you love children and you wouldn't do that to them. And that all abuse is wrong. And
language and Germany, words, huh? It's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a word thing. But you're right. I wouldn't platform somebody who had ever done that kind of thing. No, never.
And I've listened to the very first podcast I listened to, I can't remember her name, but it was the female wrestler, the Irish woman. So you speak about the hashtag Me Too in the wrestling business. The woman who was held captive in Pakistan, Dr. Sue...
Sue Black, Professor
How
Sue
could
Black.
I forget her surname? Sue, and also Johnny Benjamin, the young man who nearly jumped. He has schizophrenia, doesn't he? And he's done amazing work with raising mental health awareness, really. So it is a interesting, diverse collection of people that you talk to, really, isn't it?
Yeah. I wouldn't want listeners to think it's all about that guy I was just talking about before. No. It's a huge mix, and I like to try and surprise people. And each week it might be someone they're interested in. It might not be, then they skip over generally. Johnny Benjamin's such a lovely, lovely guy. He was so sweet. And then Sue Black is now probably my favorite episode.
It's pretty fascinating, isn't it? So for people that don't know, it's about the veins, isn't it? That her research is, and how they can use the veins to track people, all to do with the science. You explain it better than me.
Well, she invented a new way of catching sex offenders just by the vein. It's called hand vein pattern analysis or something like that.
It's amazing.
Just from their hands, because often people will film their abuse and their hands will be the only thing on show. And she's managed to prove, and it took a lot of research to do that no two hands are alike, or at least fewer than one out of like 100,000, a bit like fingerprints. So it's very unlikely, if they've caught someone and it's the father and he's got those veins, or it's the boyfriend and he has those veins or whatever, it's him. But other things as well. I mean, she worked in Kosovo, and it's quite horrific, the things she managed to do. She went through sort of her job was to identify bodies after the Kosovo war. And she was going through like melted bodies and the things she was saying. I mean, it's quite gruesome, and again, it might not be for everyone to listen to. She carried two heads in designer handbags on a passenger plane, which she managed to get through security because they needed to do some DNA stuff in Scotland. They didn't have the right stuff in Italy, so she just did that. Then she had to use designer bags so as not to perturb the other passengers. So the kinds of things she's done, and then her thoughts, just philosophy, her thoughts on death and things like that are just
I go to a book crime festival up in Stirling in Scotland, which is called Bloody Scotland, and she was there, but the tickets were gone so quickly. I would love to have heard her speak, but I will get there one day when it's back in person. So what is next for you, Andrew? Where do you see On the Edge going?
To the stratosphere and beyond. I don't know. I guess just you want it to get bigger and bigger, don't you? And I guess, they say with podcasts, once you're at sort of 10,000 or so a week, you can start to earn. So I've been putting adverts in, and then once it earns, you can spend more time on it, and you can try and double that and triple it and so on. And to just, get it, as many listeners as possible, and keep interviewing different strange people. I don't want to go for the big famous people so much. Obviously, when there's an opportunity that arises, that's great. But it's these stories. I mean, the Coffin Confessor was one.
Oh, we never spoke about the Coffin Confessor. I forgot. So he's an Australian guy, and people pay him before they die. So he goes to their funeral and basically gives the last word on behalf of the deceased.
Exactly.
What a job. I have to listen to that one. So I'm going to be very busy walking my poor little dog. It's going to be hours of walking, listening to your show.
He's great. He just blew my mind as well. And it's that thing of like, even if the podcast never had or never has success, and I'm sure you feel this way as well, every week I'm talking to the most fascinating people, with the most beautiful, beautiful stories. The Coffin Confessor had a horrible, horrible childhood involving communal and systemic rape at his school and stuff like that. And nobody wanted to talk about it. He tried to tell his parents, he tried to tell the school was doing it, you know. So he grew up with this almost pathological desire to tell the truth, which led to him becoming a private investigator. He used to go to hotels, like small hotels, and tell them like, look, give me a few months in here and I'll find out who's stealing stuff from you. And he'd like embed himself as a cleaner for months and just like find out where the other cleaners were or whatever he was doing. And then then somebody came to him once and said, look, I'm dying, I've got a few months left, and I want you to go to my funeral and tell everybody that I was gay, right? And that his lover was in the crowd. It's kind of
very sad that they had to wait till he was dead to come out, though, isn't it? Oh, yeah. That's a whole other story, really, isn't it? But when everything opens up, because as we're recording this, we are in COVID times. We're in lockdown in the UK. I'm not so sure in Berlin. Do you not want to get back to making documentaries and leave the podcast behind, or will you try and juggle both of them?
I think, yeah, juggle both of them ideally. The thing about the podcast is it's just a way, you know, between documentaries, I was making a documentary and actually selling it like once every 18 months, once every 2 years. It's just
a slog, isn't it?
Oh, it's impossible. The BBC didn't even pay me for that exorcism film. It was in their best of the year list. I didn't even. So you end up doing, I think people sometimes see the people on TV and they think like, oh, they must be wealthy or whatever it is.
Yes.
You know, most of us are doing odd jobs, minimum wage bits and pieces, which, you know, it's fine because you do it for the passion, you do it for the love. So I've been working copywriting, which is writing travel articles and things like that, and I get by from it, fortunately. So the idea is to, you know, the podcast will give me a weekly base, and then from there, as you say, yeah, I'd love to make the odd documentary once every 2 years whenever a TV channel will actually take one. And I'd love to get into writing books. So I've got this book about secrets at the moment in with.
Okay, and how far are you in the process of this book? When do we expect to be able to read it? When will it be on the shelves?
Very early days. It's at the point where like I got a literary agent for it, quite like a nice one, and we've gone back and forward, and the idea is developed so that I've got each chapter. Like a page and a half or 2 pages of each chapter of the book, that kind of thing, and I'm going to send it back to him in a few weeks, and then he'll say he doesn't want it anymore, and
no, he won't. Have faith. We have faith. Well, we look forward to reading it. It's interesting because I just did my second TEDx and it was about secret keeping. It was about the shame that keeps us quiet, so it kind of complements what you're talking about in a big way.
100%. I'm going to watch that. I knew you were doing the second TEDx. I didn't. Yes. Is it out yet?
It's not. The middle of April. So by the time this is aired, it will be available. So I shall send you the links. Out? Middle of April, I think the tape will be ready.
Oh right, sorry. Yeah. Middle of April. I thought it was now the middle of April, and it's not, is it? Now's middle of March.
We don't know what day or time it is, but anyway, we kind of come to the end of our interview there. So if people want to find out more about you, where can they find you?
They can just Twitter and Instagram, @AndrewGold_OK, and then just get on that podcast, On the Edge with Andrew Gold. It's on all the normal podcast places wherever you usually listen to them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for being a guest today on Unbroken, and I'm going to go away and listen to all these episodes now that I've missed.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Unbroken, healing through storytelling. Playing now on all the main platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher for Android, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and here. Play Unbroken, the podcast, with Madeline Black.